Modern gardening is expensive, complicated, and produces mediocre results because you've been taught to buy solutions instead of building systems. Your grandparents never stepped in a garden center, never bought fertilizer, never purchased hybrid seeds, and never sprayed pesticides. And their gardens thrived in ways yours never will until you abandon methods that keep you dependent on inputs you repurchase every season. While you're spending money on products designed to fail, so you'll buy more next year. They created soil that improved for decades, saved seeds that adapted perfectly, and grew enough to fill root cellars and canning shelves through winter. The difference isn't knowledge lost to history. It's willingness to invest time building permanent abundance instead of renting temporary convenience. Here's what made their gardens better. Your grandparents never bought potting soil, not because they couldn't afford it or garden centers didn't exist, but because buying soil made no sense when you could build better soil for free that improved every year instead of depleting every season. And what they did was compost everything: kitchen scraps, garden waste, manure from chickens or rabbits or neighbors with livestock, fallen leaves, grass clippings. Nothing organic left the property. Everything that grew went back into soil to grow again. And most used a 3-bin system or simple pile in a back corner, but the process never stopped. One bin actively decomposing, one curing, one ready to spread. Or a single pile turned every few weeks, layering green materials with brown, keeping it moist but not waterlogged, letting time and microbes do work you now pay garden centers to do with bagged products, and they turned finished compost into beds every fall and spring. Inches of it, year after year, which means their soil got richer every season instead of poorer, held moisture better instead of drying out, drained perfectly instead of staying waterlogged, and fed plants for months from fertility they'd built instead of requiring constant synthetic fertilizer. And the result was soil that worked. Soil that grew healthy plants with deep roots and strong stems and leaves so green they looked fake. Soil that buffered drought and excess rain. Soil that hosted earthworms and beneficial microbes that made nutrients available in ways chemical fertilizers never could. And modern gardeners buy bagged potting soil every spring because last year's is depleted. Buy amendments because soil lacks organic matter. Buy fertilizer because nothing grows in dead dirt. And repeat this expensive cycle every season, wondering why their grandparents' gardens thrived while theirs struggle. Because your grandparents built soil. You buy soil. And soil built over decades becomes a living system that takes care of itself. Soil bought in bags stays dead and dependent on inputs you purchase year after year. Your grandparents never bought seeds from catalogs, not hybrids that produce once then fail, not patented varieties bred for shipping instead of flavor, not seeds designed to keep you dependent on seed companies year after year. And what they did was save seed from their best plants every season, the healthiest tomato with best flavor and highest yield. Bean plants that produced earliest and resisted disease. Squash that stored longest through winter. Those were plants they marked and let go to seed, collecting and drying and storing for next year's planting. And over decades, this created something modern gardeners have lost: varieties perfectly adapted to their specific soil, climate, pests, and diseases. Because every generation of saved seed was selected from plants that thrived in those exact conditions, which means seeds got better every year. And the tomatoes your grandmother grew weren't generic hybrids shipped from California. They were tomatoes her mother grew, and her grandmother before that, selected over 50 or 70 years to produce heavily in that specific garden with that specific soil and summer weather. Seeds that knew how to handle late spring frosts and August droughts and exact pest pressure of that location. And modern gardeners can't do this because seeds you buy are hybrids. F1 hybrids bred by crossing two parent lines, which means they produce beautifully the first year. But if you save their seed, the next generation reverts to random combinations. Some plants produce nothing. Some produce tiny fruit. Some grow tall and leggy. Uniformity is gone because that's how hybrid genetics work, which forces you back to seed catalogs every spring, spending money on varieties bred for commercial growers who need tomatoes that ship well and ripen uniformly for mechanical harvesting, not home gardeners who want flavor and adaptation and reliability. And here's why soil and seeds matter more than you think. They're the foundation everything builds on, because rich soil you built grows healthy plants that resist pests. And seeds you saved adapt to your conditions and produce reliably year after year, which means you're not dependent on garden centers or seed companies or any external input you purchase every season. Your grandparents built permanent systems. You rent temporary solutions. And the difference compounds every year until their approach seems impossible and yours seems normal, when the truth is exactly backwards. Your grandparents watered by hand every morning, not with sprinklers, not with drip irrigation on timers, not with automated systems that turn on whether plants need water or not. They carried watering cans or dragged hoses and watered each plant individually, checking soil moisture with their fingers, adjusting for weather and growth stage, and specific needs of tomatoes versus lettuce versus beans. And this wasn't just about getting water to roots. It forced daily observation of every single plant. Because when you water by hand, you see things. You notice aphid eggs on the underside of one kale leaf before they hatch into infestation. You spot first yellowing that signals nitrogen deficiency while it's fixable with a shovelful of compost. You catch early blight on a single tomato leaf when removing that one leaf solves the problem instead of watching disease spread through the entire plant a week later. And modern gardeners use automation because it saves time. Set up sprinklers or drip lines, put it on a timer, never think about watering again, which sounds efficient until you realize what you've lost. Because automated watering is blind, doesn't see cucumber beetles laying eggs, doesn't notice cabbage starting to bolt in unexpected heat, doesn't catch squash vine borer holes while larvae are still small enough to dig out with a knife. And by the time you notice problems during your casual weekend walk through the garden, infestation is out of control. What could have been solved by removing one leaf or squashing one beetle now requires intervention at a scale that might not work. You're spraying entire plants, pulling up and destroying crops too far gone. Your grandparents caught problems when they were easy to fix because they knew every plant intimately, could tell you which tomato grew fastest, which bean always produced first, which pepper needed extra water because its leaves wilted sooner. And that knowledge only comes from daily attention, from spending time in the garden not as chore, but as observation, from treating each plant as an individual you're monitoring instead of a row watered on schedule, whether it needs it or not. And here's where it gets interesting, where serious gardeners separate from hobbyists who play at growing food. Because your grandparents didn't plant lettuce once in spring and beans once in early summer, then wonder why they had more than they could eat for 2 weeks, followed by nothing for the rest of the season. They planted in succession. Lettuce every 2 weeks from early spring through late summer, beans every 2 weeks from late spring through midsummer, carrots every 3 weeks from spring into fall, which means they harvested continuously in small, manageable amounts instead of getting overwhelmed by a glut they couldn't process, followed by months of buying vegetables at stores. And modern gardeners plant everything at once because that seems efficient. One big planting day in spring, maybe another in early summer. Then you wait and hope everything produces at different times, which it doesn't. Everything ripens together. You're drowning in zucchini in August and buying produce in September. But succession planting requires planning and discipline, means keeping track of what you planted when, means having transplants ready every 2 weeks, means thinking ahead instead of reacting to good weather by throwing everything into soil at once. And your grandparents also planted densely, intensive spacing in raised beds or wide permanent beds where plants were spaced just far enough to grow properly, but close enough that their leaves touched at maturity, shading soil and suppressing weeds. Modern gardeners plant wide rows with paths between because that's what seed packet diagrams show, which wastes space. Those paths grow weeds. And wasted space could be growing food. Wide spacing means soil surface stays exposed to sun, which dries it faster and creates perfect conditions for weed seeds to germinate. Intensive beds produce more food per square foot. Dense leaf coverage keeps soil moist and cool. Weeds can't establish because there's no exposed soil for them to colonize. And the whole system is more efficient because you're growing food in every available inch instead of leaving half your garden to paths and empty space. But intensive planting requires more knowledge. You can't space everything 18 inches and walk away. You need to know which plants handle tight spacing and which need room. Monitor for air circulation problems that cause disease in crowded plantings. Ensure your soil is rich enough to support higher plant density. Which is why hobbyists use wide rows and wonder why yields disappoint while serious gardeners plant intensively and harvest continuously from spring through fall. Your grandparents never sprayed pesticides, not because pesticides didn't exist, not because they were particularly concerned about chemicals, but because they didn't need to spray when they built systems where plants protected each other. And what they did was plant companions. Marigolds scattered throughout tomato beds, because marigolds repel aphids and whiteflies. Nasturtiums planted at the base of squash, because nasturtiums attract aphids away from squash, and their flowers attract predatory insects that eat pests. Herbs, like basil and oregano, and thyme between vegetables, because their strong scents confuse pest insects looking for host plants. These companion plants weren't decorative. They were functional parts of integrated pest management that worked because it was based on how plants and insects actually interact in nature instead of trying to kill everything with chemicals. And they understood traditional planting combinations modern gardeners have forgotten. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash planted together. Corn provides structure for beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen from air and feed it to corn and squash. Squash leaves shade soil and suppress weeds while their prickly stems deter raccoons from corn. Each plant serves the others. The system produces more food from the same space than any of the three crops would produce alone. And it does it without fertilizer or pesticides or any external input because plants themselves create conditions for their mutual success. And when pests did appear, your grandparents dealt with them directly, hand-picked hornworms off tomato plants, trapped slugs in shallow dishes of beer, encouraged toads and frogs by providing water and shelter because toads eat thousands of insects, put up birdhouses to attract insect-eating birds, planted flowers that attracted ladybugs and lacewings, and parasitic wasps that prey on aphids and caterpillars. Modern gardeners see a pest and reach for a spray bottle. Organic or synthetic doesn't matter. The approach is the same. Kill the symptom, which also kills beneficial insects and destroys predator populations that would have controlled pests naturally if given time. Your grandparents' approach was slower, but it built something permanent, a garden ecosystem that regulated itself, where pest outbreaks were rare because predator populations stayed high enough to keep them in check, where plants stayed healthy because soil and companion plantings created conditions that favored plant health over pest success. And here's the critical insight most modern gardeners miss. Your grandparents didn't garden to eat fresh tomatoes in August. They gardened to eat all year, which means everything they grew was planned not just for fresh consumption, but for preservation and storage. And they mastered every preservation method. Canning turned summer tomatoes into sauce and paste that lasted through winter. Cucumbers became pickles that kept for months in cellars. Cabbage fermented into sauerkraut. Beans dried on the vine became winter protein. Peppers dried or froze. Beets and carrots and potatoes went into root cellars where they stayed fresh until spring. Modern gardeners plant a few tomato plants to eat fresh for 6 weeks in summer. Your grandparents planted enough tomatoes to eat fresh and put up 50 quarts of sauce and 20 quarts of whole tomatoes and 10 quarts of salsa, which meant they calculated backward from winter needs to determine summer planting quantities. And this required a completely different scale of thinking. If you need vegetables for 12 months, you can't plant a small hobby garden. You need serious quantities, and you need infrastructure, root cellars or cool basements for storing roots and winter squash, canning equipment and jars and lids, dehydrators or screened boxes for drying, freezers if you could afford them. But the investment paid off because it meant independence. Your grandparents' primary food source wasn't grocery stores. It was their own preserved harvest. Grocery stores were backup for things they couldn't grow or preserve, not the default option for daily meals. And modern gardeners have this backward. They garden for the fun of eating fresh vegetables for a few weeks, then return to buying everything for the other 10 months. Which means gardening stays a hobby instead of becoming food security. Because food security requires year-round supply. And year-round supply requires preservation. And preservation requires growing surplus. And growing surplus requires planning and space and effort. Modern gardeners don't want to invest because they've never experienced the vulnerability of depending entirely on stores that might have empty shelves or prices you can't afford. Your grandparents lived through that vulnerability. They knew what it meant to need food you couldn't buy, which is why they built systems that made them independent instead of gardens that entertained them. These practices weren't separate techniques your grandparents happened to use. Soil building, seed saving, daily observation, succession planting, companion systems, preservation. They were one integrated system where each part supported all the others. Because rich soil you built over decades grew healthy plants that resisted pests naturally. And those healthy plants produced seeds you saved that were already adapted to thrive in that rich soil. And daily observation while hand watering caught problems before they spread through those adapted plants. And succession planting provided continuous harvests you needed to preserve enough food for year-round supply. And preservation justified the effort of growing surplus in the first place. Everything connected. No single practice worked alone. The whole system was greater than the sum of its parts because each element made the others more effective. And modern gardening takes the opposite approach. Isolated techniques purchased from different sources, bagged soil that depletes, hybrid seeds that can't adapt, automated watering that blinds you to problems, single plantings that create gluts or shortages, chemical sprays that destroy beneficial insects, growing for fresh eating with no plan for preservation. Nothing connects. Each practice exists independently, which means when one fails, the whole garden struggles because there's no integrated system supporting it. Your grandparents invested years building their system, added compost every season for decades, selected and saved seeds through countless generations, learned which companions worked through trial and observation, developed preservation skills and built infrastructure, created gardens that improved themselves over time because each year's work made next year easier and more productive. Modern gardeners restart every spring. New soil, new seeds, new problems approached with the same purchased solutions that didn't work last year. Nothing accumulates, nothing improves. Every season is a fresh gamble instead of continuation of a system that's been building momentum for years. And the time investment explains everything. Your grandparents thought in decades, planted fruit trees knowing they wouldn't harvest for 5 years, but their children would harvest for 50. Built soil knowing each year would be slightly better than the last. Saved seeds knowing the 10th generation would outperform the first. You think in seasons. Plant in spring, harvest in summer, start over next year, which works for hobbies but fails for food security. So why did your grandparents' gardens grow better than yours? Not because of luck, not because climate was different, not because they had mysterious talent you lack, because they built systems and you buy solutions. They built soil that improved for decades while you buy bags that deplete in weeks. They saved seeds that adapted over generations while you buy hybrids designed to fail after one season. They observed daily and caught problems early while you automate and spray chemicals when it's too late. They planted for year-round food supply while you plant for summer salads, then return to grocery stores. Modern gardening is an expensive hobby that keeps you dependent on external inputs you repurchase every season. Bagged soil, hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation systems, everything purchased, nothing permanent, nothing that improves itself over time. Their gardening was a food security system that needed nothing outside itself once established. Soil fed itself through composting. Seeds improved themselves through selection. Pest control came from companion plants and beneficial insects. Water came from hand carrying and observation. Year-round supply came from preservation infrastructure they built once and used for decades. And the difference between these approaches isn't knowledge that's been lost. The information still exists. You can learn to compost and save seeds and plant companions and preserve harvests. The difference is willingness to invest time building permanent systems instead of renting temporary convenience. Because building systems requires years of patient work with no shortcuts. Adding compost every season for a decade before soil reaches its potential. Saving and selecting seeds through multiple generations before they're perfectly adapted. Learning companion combinations through seasons of trial and error. Developing preservation skills through practice and occasional failure. Modern gardeners want results this season, want to buy their way to success, which works for hobbies but fails for food security because food security requires systems that produce reliably year after year without constant purchased inputs. Your grandparents built those systems because they understood dependence on stores you can't control is vulnerability you can't afford. And the gardeners who build systems instead of buying solutions are the ones who achieve real food independence while everyone else plays at self-sufficiency while staying dependent.